no, but it does mean that as parents, we ought to help this child work through whatever they're dealing with. And we'll talk about what might be underlying in a moment. Yes?
Yeah, I want to add to that also. One of my kids was at that young of an age 6, was bullied, even at an early age in kindergarten.
Right.
The building blocks, another kid comes and knocks him down.
Yep.
The coloring, another kid comes and rips it up. That even, yes, it can start that early.
It could. Okay. So, I don't want everybody to leave this class and just lawyer up. Call your lawyer, my kid. That's not what I'm suggesting. This is, let's keep a level head about this, folks. I'm an administrator of a couple of schools. I'm not looking for that. That being said, okay, so the other two, though, seem to be perhaps a little clearer. A 12-year-old is part of a clique that regularly humiliates the less popular kids in class, bullying or not?
Yes.
No question about it. No question about it. Now, again, even though we would say, well, when we were growing up, that was a pretty normal thing. That wasn't something that we called out as bullying. It doesn't matter. Understand that those kids who suffered through that, their lives were changed by it. The choices they made in life, the willingness to go out on a date changes when you have that over time going over and over and over and getting pounded on. These things are very, very real. If you go and look at some lectures and other things online, YouTube's, from professors, from very eminent people talking about this, who study this full time, it's actually harrowing to hear the kind of effect that it has on somebody who is bullied. They talk about it as that the neural receptors, the same ones that are fired with real physical pain, when they are bullied or shunned, it is the same kind of receptors. It's the same kind of pain. It's a psychological pain, but it's real. It's measurable. It is very, very powerful. So so when they say sticks and stones can break your bones, remember that? It's not true. It actually can. And, okay. So as mentioned, it's very important to know what bullying is and to keep our eye out for it because of its did you want to answer? Because of its devastating consequences. Let's take a look at some of the consequences, the effects of bullying in text 4A. Somebody will read, please. Who wants to? Go ahead, Brent.
Kids who are bullied can experience negative physical, school, and mental health issues. Kids who are bullied are more likely to experience depression and anxiety, increased feelings of sadness and loneliness, changes in sleep and eating patterns, and loss of interest in activities they used to enjoy. These issues may persist into adulthood. Health complaints and decreased academic achievement, GPA and standardized test scores, and school participation. They are more likely to miss, skip, or drop out of school.
So the problem with this is that these are these are sort of like, it's like saying, what are the symptoms of the flu? They're really hard. Kids go through stuff. Kids go through anxiety. Kids go through periods of time that they don't want to go to school and they complain of stomach aches. This stuff happens for a whole variety of reasons. What we're looking for is consistent patterns, because what a child who's bullied in school is going to show this over time, continuously, more and more and more, and obviously you have to go through the other things that may be. A child who's not achieving in school might also go through some of these anxiety, certain health issues, stress issues. But again, we're looking for this over time with interventions, speaking to the teacher. We got to do all of these things in order to find it, but it is important to understand that the consequences are real. It turns out that what happens is that somebody who is bullied, they tend to they go through phases. At first, they withdraw. At first they become very compliant, and they're willing to do favors that are extreme. They want to find favor in the eyes of the bullier. Okay, so these are kids who are the one who is a target for bullying. Usually, and we're going to talk about it in a moment, has low self-esteem and is struggling with that. And those are the people who are targeted for bullying. If a child has lower self-esteem, that somehow the bully senses that. They sense this, that this one is somebody who's not going to retaliate, who's not going to speak up, cannot or won't. And so the first thing that this person wants to do is become more compliant. They become more controllable. And if that doesn't work, they withdraw. And in extreme cases, they lash out when they finally snap, they lash out in extreme anger and violence even. To the point that since the 1990s, in the 90s there were about 15 major school shootings. 12 of the 15 shooters were kids who were consistently bullied. They had gone through all the phases of bullying. They were at the extreme anger phase where it was, now that's not to say that a kid who's bullied is going to end up there, God forbid. It's a very rare occurrence. But at the same time, it does give us a sense of some of the rage that can ensue from consistently being pounded by everybody around them, and nobody's listening. Nobody's finding the signs. And so the extreme of that is a lashing out with really extreme anger. Text 4b describes some of this. Kids who bully others, now this is now the bullier, can also engage in violent and other risky behaviors into adulthood. Kids who bully are more likely to abuse alcohol and other drugs in adolescence and as adults, get into fights, vandalize property, and drop out of school, engage in early sexual activity, have criminal convictions and traffic citations as adults, be abusive towards their romantic partners, spouses, or children as adults. So this cycle, so it doesn't only affect the bullied, it affects the bullier. The bully continually, it escalates. It gets worse. They tend to be, these are kids who, some of the signs that they talk about are kids who will be very, very aggressive with animals. They'll be cruel to animals. It's the same kind of tendency that grows. So the bully continually gets worse if they're unchecked. So just as important as it is to make sure that our kids are not exhibiting signs of being bullied, it's important for us to make sure that our kids are not exhibiting signs of being a bully. And again, the consequences on either end of that spectrum are terrible for both the one who's bullied and the one who's doing the bullying. It turns out, by the way, there's a lot of studies, we're not getting into it here, but it affects the entire environment. For the kids who are watching and feel helpless to step inside, they also start to have, on some scale, they also start to have some of the, in a limited sense, the effect of being bullied. They're in an environment where they're being challenged to step up and they don't feel that they have it within them to step up. And so the bully, he thrives off of those people around him who are not going to step up and say anything, and people feel very bad about not stepping up. They go home and at the moment they might laugh or kind of go along with it, but later on they feel very, very bad. So it creates an entire very, very unhealthy environment, obviously. So we know what bullying is, and we know a lot of the ugly consequences, both for the perpetrator and for the victim. But if we're to stop or work with children who are bullies, we have to understand its underlying causes. And we need to understand, at least in some sense, what causes a child to be a bully and what makes a child an attractive target to be bullied. So here's our questions for discussion on page 100. What causes a child to bully others? What makes a particular child more attractive as a target for bullies? Okay? So it turns out that low self-esteem is a pretty major factor in a child who is a target to be bullied. In all kinds of studies all over the place, they list low self-esteem as very, very relevant to being bullied. It's among the most important factors for being both a perpetrator and the one being bullied. That's what's interesting. It's not just the one who's being bullied, it's also the one who's doing the bullying, is very often suffers from low self-esteem. I'll explain it in a minute. Now, this isn't absolute. This is not absolute. There can be other factors. There can be factors like it starts out with something very, a child who looks different, a child who has an accent, speaks different, comes from a foreign country. There's a lot of factors that can make somebody a target. But for sure, a accelerating factor. The one, in other words, if there are two kids from a foreign country, the one who's going to get picked on is the one who sort of the sharks sort of recognize, they smell blood. They smell that this is a target who's not going to have the wherewithal to stand up for themselves. And so how do we understand this correlation between low self-esteem and the higher risk factor for bullying? So it's some kind of innate sense that the bully has as to who is a good target. Now, this, by the way, this goes on later on in life too. A mugger, an attacker, somebody somebody who has perpetrated a sexual assault. They tend to prey on. There's some kind of sense that they have of who is weak and vulnerable. And so it starts from a very, very early age as to who is not going to respond or to buy into this. But now for the connection between the bully's low self-esteem and his bullying, let's take a look at text 5 if somebody will read for us on page 101. Go ahead, Stuart.
The bully's ego is artifice. His arrogance is a hollow confidence. This ego for him is a fragile thing, driven by fear and narcissism, not by power nor by the power he wishes so desperately to possess. He feeds on our fear, but his hunger is driven solely by his own. The key for the bullied is to recognize that the bully's bullying is not about us. It's about him and his weakness. It's about his sense of being threatened and his horror at being found out as an imposter or opposer. He is afraid, quite afraid, and all the time.
So those who lack self-esteem, they need to find a way to esteem themselves, to find esteem. And so many of them try to gain it by demonstrating to themselves that they're superior than those who otherwise, to others. And so they feel that by controlling others and belittling them and putting them down, so somehow they're going to gain a feeling of superiority over them. And in this way, gain some kind of artificial sense of worth. It's almost like I'm going to take away somebody else's self-worth, and I'm going to take it, and therefore it's going to somehow be mine. Versus having a sense of value in and of myself, I need to find value in putting somebody else down. In a very tiny, tiny way, I don't want to compare this to bullying, and it's like you said, the story of the 5-year-old and the 6-year-old. But this story and the way in which this Rebbe dealt with it with his 2 children is very telling because it kind of describes the whole dynamic. Text number 6. Who wanted to read? Trudy, were you raising your hand before?
No, but I will.
Thank you.
As a small child, Reb Zalman Aharon, the Raza, the older brother of Rebbe Shalom Dov Ber of Lubavitch, the Rashab, often complained that he was noticeably shorter than his younger brother. One day, the Raza sneaked up behind his brother and pushed him lightly into a small ditch. As the Rashab stood up in surprise, the Raza seized the moment and pointed out that now he was taller. Rabbi Shmuel of Lubavitch, the father of the 2 boys, observed the entire episode. The Rebbe asked for a chair, ordered the Raza to stand on it, and asked him, "Tell me, who's taller now?" The Raza answered excitedly that yet again he was taller. "Aha," said Rabbi Shmuel. "There you are. To be bigger than your friend, there is no need to pull him down. Simply elevate yourself."
The idea here, because what he was addressing was the root of the problem. His desire to push down his younger brother, pretty normal. It's normal. Brothers do this for all kinds of reasons. But the root idea here was, and from his enjoyment, his excitement, now I'm taller, and from this artificial being taller by pushing down the other, again, he wanted to get to the root of the matter. And so he illustrated in a very, very tactile way, get up on a chair, raise yourself up, and then you have self-value. Then you can be worth something. Again, all being a metaphor, obviously, but one that is really, really follows the idea that he's trying to bring out. We never make ourselves greater by pulling somebody else down, making somebody else smaller. But the bully is addicted to doing that as a way to compensate for their negative self-image, for their negative self-worth. And in this way, he was teaching that never do you raise yourself up by, in any way, shape, or form, pushing somebody else down. I just want to say that this isn't relegated to children. This is something that we as adults constantly do. We constantly do it. When we throw in a remark about, somebody in the group who happens to not be present at the moment, about, oh yeah, and we put in a little detail there about, you know that person. They always, whatever that issue is. We continue these snide remarks that we make in social settings about one another. This is about whether sometimes it can be about jealousy, sometimes it can be about all kinds of things, and it doesn't end in childhood. Maybe the blatant exercise of it hopefully does, even then not always, but this is something that all of us sometimes have a tendency to do.
Okay. I have a question, but you don't have to answer it.
Do I ever do it?
Oh, but later. The question is, you brought up something, is that if you interview 60% of the kids now or whatever, they'll
tell a story.
report. Okay, and my question to you, which you can answer later because you're in the middle of all this, is why do you think that is more prevalent now? And in my generation, if you ask that question, you probably wouldn't get 60%. And my question is that you can answer later, why do you think bullying is such prevalent now in 60%, and maybe in my generation, it probably wasn't. But you can answer later.
You know what? When we finish tonight's lesson, I think we might find that there's a change in parenting, perhaps, that maybe we can bolster, that might change that. That might be one reason. First of all, it's more studied, number one. In other words, back in the day, there wasn't this terminology, which always helps to bring it to the fore. But I think there is something underlying. I think there's something deeper. Yes, kids used to get in fist fights and get blood. Kids probably get in fist fights. I don't know. Nah, it's not fair to say. I was going to say that it was normal to fight and to have these cliques and groups and whatever. We didn't necessarily then see it as bullying, although if defined that way, maybe there would have been. But let's take a look at some of the parenting things and see if that can have any effect on this. So both of them, both the bully, as mentioned, and the bully, they tend to have this sense of low self-esteem. So there are two types of people. There are two different character types, and both of them relate to low self-esteem in a little bit of a different way. So the bully, if we're going to the caricature of the bully, is sort of the extreme version of the aggressive, dismissive, contemptuous, contentious person, while the bully's victim is the extreme version of timid, apprehensive, or unconfident person. Both of them deal with their self-esteem issues in opposite ways. One of them projects it by putting down the other, and the other one just continually shrinks in the face of all of it. So the answer to both of this, in a big way, both of them, the answer is to somehow build a healthy sense of self-esteem that they can hang their hat on, so they don't need to resort to bullying and don't need to suffer being bullied. Okay? So how do we build self-esteem? So in order to understand that, we need to understand what is self-esteem. And there are books and there are studies and there's so much to talk about what is self-esteem. And so we're not going to get into a whole academic study of what self-esteem is. But what we want to talk about is a few important components of what makes up self-esteem. We're going to talk about two components of self-esteem tonight that are very actionable, very practical in terms of how we can affect our children's self-esteem. And we're just going to focus on those two. We're not going to focus on the whole spectrum. And they are as follows. Number one, a feeling of personal competence. Okay? Self-esteem is built by, and it's a characteristic of self-esteem, that I have personal competence. We want our children to feel that they have the ability to accomplish and to succeed in tasks, schoolwork, relationships, sports, whatever it is that they set their mind to. We want them to have a sense of competence in doing whatever it is they need to do. That builds self-esteem. The more competence they feel, the more competent they are at a certain activity, the more self-esteem they will feel. Okay? So we want to build a sense of personal competence. That's number one. And number two, and this is sort of the flip side, this is another side, different than competence, and that is an intrinsic sense of worth. Not because of anything I did, not because of anything I've exhibited, not because I have expressed competence, but because as a human being, as a child of my mother, as a child of my father, as a Jew, as a human being, a person who, and we're going to talk about, this is very much where the neshama comes in, teaching about the soul. Meaning, and what's the idea of the soul? That God gave me a soul. God put me here in this world for a reason. He saw fit that I should be here. I have purpose. I have meaning. Not because of anything I've accomplished yet, but simply because I am. That is what we call intrinsic self-worth. So we want to show competence as well as intrinsic self-worth. And both of these things, they will build confidence, they'll build a self-esteem, a healthy sense of self-esteem. And so now for the rest of the lesson, we're going to talk about how to do that. Any questions? Okay. Page 103. So take a minute here and describe the advantages or disadvantages of both of the self-concepts of the following four children. So we have four children here, A, B, C, and D. And we have here a grid of intrinsic worth and competence in the upper left-hand column. They feel incompetent, but they feel intrinsically worthy is child B. Child C feels competence, but doesn't feel intrinsically worthy. And child D feels intrinsically unworthy and incompetent. Let's take a minute and just jot down a couple words for each of these kids. What are these kids? What do they feel like? What